ちよのお Chia, 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 no. Doki, 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 doki. Chia, 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 no. Suki, 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 chia, no. Hey everyone, how's it going? Shut up, Chio. I love you, but shut the hell up. But hello. Hey everybody, how's it going? I didn't really have anything to say. I just wanted to say hi. I turned 35 yesterday. That was certainly something. I didn't do much that day. I had cake and beer. That was it. And yeah, and then I started this animation thing that I don't know. I had this dream a while ago where I had this conversation, and I thought it would be worthwhile to make a little animation out of it. But hold on, let me show you the cake that I had yesterday, because because I should at least show something. There you go. That was the cake and beer that I had for my birthday yesterday. Yeah, it was alright. It's pretty cool. I enjoyed that cake. I still have a slice left in the fridge. Looking forward to that. But right now, I'm looking forward to this smoked salmon that I have in front of me. Yeah, that I'm going to be eating through this stream, I guess. I don't know how long this is going to take. This is only going to be like 30 seconds of animation, but it takes a while, you know, because as a sensitive artist, I kind of want to get invested and, you know, invest myself into my craft, you know, because I take art very seriously here. I'm a very serious artist. But yeah, don't know how long this stream is gonna last, but I thought I would stick up a little podcast or something to listen to whilst I work on my craft. And yeah, we'll see how it goes. There's this one YouTube channel that I've been following for a while called Esoterica, and he does like nice little video essays on the more supernatural and esoteric side of things. So yeah, it's good to listen to. But yeah, I'll stick this on and then I'll just get right into it. Actually, I'll just show you what I have so far. So got some frames. It's a little conversation. So basically, the dream that I had, which I'm animating here, is that I attend my very first convention, and I was hanging out with a band that I was really into growing up, In Flames. I was hanging out with In Flames in my first convention, and then I was having this conversation with them, and the conversation pretty much goes like this. Hey, you know, for my first convention, I'm actually having a really great time hanging out. Yeah, I'm glad to hear it. This is certainly a lot better than the last convention I was at. Really? What was wrong with it? Well, some weirdo brought a shotgun and just blew his head off right in the middle of it. Damn. That sucks. Yeah, so that's pretty much how it goes. So I'm just gonna add a bit more detail to it. It's gonna be like, I'm not gonna put too much effort into this animation. This is just meant to be like a sort of shit post. But yeah, I'm just gonna do this. Gonna stick a video on, and I'll get to work.
Nearly half of Americans believe in ghosts.
Let's see. I'm also gonna open my packet of smoked salmon here.
That number is even a bit higher among
when I figure out where the pull tab is.
Sure, this is a completely reasonable
It should be
belief.
here, I think.
Stories of the restless dead appear in virtually
No?
every civilization and people group, with such tales going
Give me
back
a
to
second.
the earliest times of writing.
I
and with
found the
remarkable
peely bit. I
similarities
found the
through
part where
time.
it splits
I
into
suspect they go
two,
well back
where the
into
plastic
history.
splits into
But
two.
under closer inspection, the
Gonna
concept of the
open it
ghost
up.
isn't quite as timeless or as cross-cultural as it may first appear.
Isn't
Indeed,
it?
The ghost has evolved, we might say. under
Hold
the
on, I'm gonna
culture
need
and
my
religious
fucking
pressures of
knife here to
history.
open it up.
What ghost very often became was precisely what ghost needed to be for those pretending to spiritual authority. And this is on no clearer display than in the transformation of the ghosts in some of the very distinct periods.
Oh my god, my smoked salmon is trapped within this like fucking plastic sarcophagus. Let me try and do this. Oh yeah, this knife that I got, it's my first full length knife made by Glock, the same people who made those guns. And yeah, so I could tell people that I actually own a Glock, but you know, in knife form. But there we go. That should free up my smoked salmon. Oh yes, I'm looking forward to this because I am rather peckish, if I do say so myself. Ooh, listen to that. Ooh, that smells wonderful. I do enjoy a bit of smoked salmon. Do you enjoy a bit of smoked salmon, chat? Do let us know. Not that I care or anything, but do let us know. just so I have
But let's
content.
explore some moments in the history of the evolution of
Hold on,
Lemuroid
let me take my
king
first bite
ghosts,
of smoked
and
salmon.
how those evolutionary processes still informed
Ooh,
our
this is gonna be so dope.
conceptions
Ooh, I've
of
got
the
some
rest of
soy sauce and
dead.
wasabi to go with it.
I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to
To
Esoterica, where we
Esoterica.
explore the arcane in history,
Yeah, I found this channel. I
philosophy,
was going through like a little esoteric moment, and I was also unemployed, and I was like, yeah, okay, let's find some esoteric videos to, further explore these themes that I'm reading up upon. And yeah, I found this channel, and yeah, he gives really nice essays and whatnot. And next thing you know, I was subscribed to him. Oh, that's fucking awesome. Okay, cool. I need to work on these
The
frames.
concept of the ghost does seem timeless. The misty, spectral being hovering translucently
So
in the
these are fun. I kind of
gloomy
want to add more
corridors of
people
some
into the background here.
forlorn, derelict, and liminal space. And yet,
I've never been
that
to a
image
convention,
of
so I'm
the
not quite
ghost
sure what
is
sort of people would be in
anything
there.
other than
I imagine there might
timeless.
be like
It's
some
very much a conception
some
of the ghost
furries or
that
something
primarily
in the
emerges
corner.
from the 19th century Northern
That's a little
European Gothic movement.
that's a little
While a
OG
ghost
reference
in a
there, if anyone
jungle or a
knows.
windswept desert tomb may
Um,
seem maybe perhaps a bit
I
foreign
might
to
stick
us,
some furries in a
I
corner
suspect
here.
that those would be the ghosts of the Mayans, and they were indeed the ghosts
Not
of
like
the
that
Egyptians.
though.
Like all
In this
meme
frame.
or
Okay,
mimetic
there we go.
information packets, the
Strength,
concept
full
of the
strength.
ghost tells us often as much about us as it does about any of the metaphysical
That's the
properties of
wrong
the disembodied dead.
pen size.
assuming that's
0.02
what ghosts are.
is more like it. I'm
Our
trying to be
conception of
consistent
ghosts has
here.
evolved and mutated given very concrete social and especially religious pressures, such that the ghosts that we
I don't know if I
take
should
to
go
be
for like a
timeless
full-blown
only appear
furry,
timeless because
or
they are,
I
in
don't know
fact,
if they
the
deserve any
result of the
recognition,
very
but
same pressures
I don't
that
know if I should go with like a
produce
full-blown
us,
furry in fursuit,
beings
or
of the
just a
present,
person
most
with like
often
cat
blissfully
ears.
ignorant of the very processes of which we are too the result. But
we
ghosts
go.
are fascinating because by studying their evolution, we're given perhaps a surprisingly nuanced glimpse into our very history, or at least some relatively oblique and admittedly esoteric dimensions of it. Of course, there's no way this video could pretend to be a comprehensive history of Western European ghosts, but let's take a look at a few vignettes of the
That looks furry
development
enough,
of
I
the
suppose.
the ghosts of Christianization, the resurrection of ghosts in contact with Germanic paganism, the war over ghosts between Protestants and Catholics, and the ghosts that continue to haunt the Enlightenment, much to the chagrin of the rationalists and the empiricists, to again
To the
get a
chagrin.
glimpse of the history of just how ghosts evolved and how we evolved with them. Late antique Christians had a, let's call it, complicated relationship with the Romanization of their religion. On the one hand, Christianity had become thoroughly Romanized, at least in a social sense, very early on, decoupling themselves from their Judean origins before being adopted as the official religion of an empire that once sought their eradication. It's a fantastic success story. And yet, Christian theologians were at pains to divorce themselves from the Roman religion that they viewed
Bit of
as,
a want a
well,
furry here,
pagan.
actually. Maybe if I
Of
made it
course, the various
smaller.
gods and goddesses were transformed, demoted into demons,
Nah, I'm not into
promoted
that.
into angels, and variously erased,
Let's
rehabilitated,
try a
reformed,
person
and
with cat ears.
remixed. But the Romans also held to a wide belief in the idea of specific household deities, but also specifically deities of the deceased, such as restless lemures or malevolent spirits, and the more beneficent ancestral manes or the lares spirits of a specific home. And indeed,
not
if you've ever
that.
seen a Roman tombstone, you
Raptor should
probably see it
be not
blazoned
like
with the
that.
abbreviation DMS.
That's grabbing the wrong
which is
direction.
Manibus
Don't know what the hell's going
Sacrum,
on here.
meaning something like sacred to the ghost gods or the ancestor spirits. And of course, the culture of the ancestor spirits was an important aspect of Roman religion, such that the living had to retain right relationship with the dead, a largely cross-cultural phenomena. In fact, failing this, or if a person were to die violently or unjustly or with something undone in their life, they may return as a lemure or a larva, seeking out
lemure.
justice or vengeance or just to be buried. Indeed, the prototypical haunted house story for the Romans was to be found in the first century tale recorded by Pliny the Younger, where Athenodorus, a Stoic philosopher no less, pacifies a ghost in an Athenian home that he's renting. In fact, I've done a whole episode on this fantastic Roman ghost story if you want to check that out. I even copied out the entire story in a period hand on papyrus because, well, it is esoterica after all. But the Roman understanding of the restless dead returning in any form was just anathema to the early Christians. God alone was worthy of worship, and any adoration paid to the dead was just absolutely forbidden by the legislation of God given to Moses. Further, the dead were thought by the early Christians to be set into a kind of spiritual hibernation, sleeping as it were, while awaiting for the final judgment of God. Then and only then would they be brought back to life, physically brought back to life, and then subject to divine justice, then allowed to enter into the heavenly kingdom of God, or cast down into perdition, where the worm never dies and the fire is not quenched. Simply put, the dead were just under the unique jurisdiction of the one God. They were causally inert, and thus they could not be much aided or interact with the living. And of course, the principal architect of this line of early Western Christian understanding of the role of God, the living, and the dead was St. Augustine. It's always going to be St. Augustine.
See if
But
boobs will
addressing
work
the
here.
nature of the proper Christian relationship to the departed, Augustine, in texts like the 421 on the care to be taken for the dead,
My God,
De
420
Cura pro
mentioned?
Mortuis Curenda, lays out the position that will become normative for hundreds of years into the development of Christianity. Relying on the New Testament tale of the rich man and Lazarus, St. Augustine held that there is no transit between the realms of the post-mortem punishment and reward, but also no transit from the realm of the post-mortem punishment to the world of the living. Recall that the suffering rich man in that story wanted to return to warn his sons of his torture following death, but just isn't allowed to do so. Thus, Augustine holds that an insuperable gulf divides the living and the dead, and thus tales of manes and lemures and other spirits of the dead, they're simply false and thus theologically suspect, to say the least. But what to do with all the visions that people seem to have of just such entities? Indeed, there are so many cases that seem
Ooh, I think I'll
genuinely
have
to
another
puzzle
bite of
Augustine,
smoked salmon
such
in the
as when
meantime.
ghosts convey secret
That was such hard
information, or
work. I
actually
think I
even
deserve a
bring
break.
the living to change their life into a life of Christian repentance. Thus, Augustine speculates that perhaps some of these visions are actually just angels or divine heralds.
Man, who would have thought
which
that drawing
appear
anime
in the
cat
form of
girls
spirits of the deceased
would be
to
such hard
convey some
work?
solace of the
There we
living, as
go,
he
got
has
another
it,
slice of
or for
smoked
the
salmon
need of
here.
redemption through repentance. So the first theory is it's angels appearing as if they were deceased
Well,
people.
gonna have a bite.
Further, in
Bon
rare cases,
appetit.
it may be that saints, at least, are allowed to appear in
Ooh, that was
some
good. I think I
form,
might have
such as
another bite.
Moses and Elijah at the Transfiguration. But for Augustine, these cases are very, very unusual and limited to the saints alone. But do recall that in the story of the rich man and Lazarus, the rich man is told that he can't return, but it never says that the righteous dead can't return in that story. So that kind of leaves that door open.
Look at that.
Other encounters with such ghosts may be
Got a big
spiritual
slice here.
visions given through the grace of God for the edification of the believer or penitent, and may occur while sleeping.
I'm eating
and
the
while
smoked salmon with
awake.
chopsticks like it's
However,
sashimi or
Augustine
something,
contends
but
such a vision is not
as you should really.
not a manifestation of the spirit of a dead person, but a kind of miraculous hallucination. Indeed, he argues that if the dead could visit their loved ones with news of the other side, or just out of love, then why doesn't his
Aw,
loving
that's sweet.
mother, Monica, visit him daily, or any of these people? Finally, Augustine must deal with the heaps of tales of
Okay.
the malevolent spirits of the dead whose groaning, rapping on walls, casting stones, and otherwise vexing the living needs to be accounted for. And of course, these aren't the spirits of the dead either, but they're just, you guessed it, they're just demons who seek everything from tormenting the believers to the damnation of the human soul as an outrage of God. Basically, when any malevolent supernatural thing happens for Augustine, it's always going to be demons. Thus, the earliest systematic analysis of ghosts in the Latin West was in the service of driving a metaphysical wedge between Christian attitudes and those they took to be decadent Roman paganism, either in their spiritual taxonomies of the dead, but also in what Augustine and similar other Christians took to be their lavish and equally superstitious, useless, frankly, funerary customs. Again, customs that the Romans themselves took to be properly honoring the dead, to prevent them from coming back, whereas Christians held that such honors were just idolatrously misplaced, preferring simpler interment and hope for the resurrection. You just pray for them that they'll come back and be judged rightly by God. Thus, in effect, Augustine had exercised Christian metaphysics of all such spectral beings, with the rare exception again of the appearance of
Not
the
quite sure what I
saints.
want to put in this
And
corner
thus
here.
it would seem that ghosts as such should have just vanished altogether in the Latin West, replaced with angels, visions, and most of all, demonic intrusions and illusions. But that simply wasn't the case. And when Christianity came into contact with Germanic pagans now to the north, along with the inevitable
I wasn't sure if I was
existence
using
of
the right
continued
thickness
popular
there,
beliefs and manifestations of the dead,
but
new
I'm gonna
theological
roll with
developments
it.
paved the way for the return of the spirits of the dead. In some sense, the ghosts got ghosts, despite St. Augustine. And also, I just believe that Christian folk beliefs and ghosts continue just fine as usual, regardless of the scribbles of theologians. Theologians and philosophers often think they have a much bigger impact than they in fact do. But as Christianity moved north into Europe, it encountered the Germanic peoples whose mythology, like most mythology, is rich in tales of interactions with the restless dead. And these people converted and influenced Christian mythology. The great strategic strength of Christianity, to my mind, has always been its ability to, at first, syncretize, all the while drawing converts nearer and nearer, all the same, to Roman Orthodoxy, playing the long game version of acclimating them to Christianity. But these ghostly elements made their way into written Christian narratives. Further, these encounters were primarily occurring in the period of time leading up to the year 1000, the millennium widely held by Christians to be the season for the return of Christ. In fact, an Islamic scholar said that they threw a huge party for the return of Christ in the year 1000, and Christ failed to show up. This period, however, will be witness to all kinds of natural marvels, including the appearance of comets, earthly convulsions, the failures of crops, and the general painful messianic birth pangs of the apocalypse. This period would also blur the line between the living and the dead, with specters
What if I made this
appearing
guy,
en
like,
masse.
dab?
Indeed, the literature of this period would just
There we
be
go.
chock full of accounts of encounters with the restless dead.
Oh, sick.
But the theological linchpin that would allow such visitations of the dead over and
Hell yeah, he
against
looks fucking
the
cool.
theology of St. Augustine would be the development of one of the most important ideas in Catholic theology, purgatory. In this theological position, the sins accumulated in life must be purged and thus purified in death before the admittance into heaven. Thus, even for the sinning righteous meant for heaven, that would still need that they would
Alright, this is
undergo
filling up quite
post-mortem
nicely.
purification, often
What
through
about
the
her hair, though? Her
punishing
hair
fires,
is
and
throwing
hence
me off.
purgation
Don't
of
like
their
it.
sins in, well, purgatory. This notion would be under a profound development around the turn of the millennium, ultimately reaching its maturity between around 1170 and 1200. But around these three developments, the millennium changing, the Germanic mythology injection, the pre-apocalyptic manifestations, and the development of purgatory, would result in a ghostly revolution. Ghosts were back on the agenda again. But as early as Pope Gregory the Great in the 7th century, we have tales of ghostly bathhouse attendants who were serving out penance for their sins committed while alive. Here, the prayers of the living are allowed to allow the spirits to go onward in their afterlife journey. Of course, these lessons are meant to be a type of circumspection of the restless dead, and as such, they're lessons for pious living. But in a significant manner, we have in St. Gregory's dialogues an early reappearance of ghosts after them being banished by Augustine. In Bede's 8th century ecclesiastical history, we see some transitional ghost stories there as well. Here, the righteous dead, though not necessarily saints, again, an important distinction vis-a-vis Augustine, they appear to monks and nuns either to assist them into death or to warn them against a dangerous missionary journey. Here, the ghost of the abbotess Ethelberga, I told you we were in Germanic lands, Ethelberga guides the nun Torgith to the day of her death after a terrible illness, and the ghostly monk Boysil leads Egbert, again, we're real Germanic now,
Egbert.
to Ireland and away from a mission in Germany. In both cases, interestingly enough, the ghostly visitor was once the supervised of the visited. The 11th century Saxon bishop Theitmar of Merseburg used the appearance of various ghosts, one warning a man of his imminent doom. In many cases,
Yeah, like I said, I don't
appearances
know
of
what
ghosts in
goes on at a
fictional forms
convention, but I'm
guide.
gonna
So if
assume
you
there's
were to
like
see a
gonna be a
ghost, you
cat
would soon
somewhere.
become one. Another involves a priest
There
being
we go.
burned alive by a ghost, so in a church no less. Others still make great groaning noises like the falling of trees. These ghost narratives were also set into theological polemics with the local Slavs, who Thurmart held that apparently they believe that everything finishes
Hell
at
yeah,
the
I'm
point
gonna
of
save
death,
that.
though the local
I'll
Slavs
put you
never
here.
really tell us what they believed. Perhaps the most outstanding of all of these accounts are those involving not the appearance of singular ghosts who require the prayers of the living or warnings for the living, but the vast appearance of revenant congregations and even wraith armies. Yes, wraith armies. Around 1000, and shortly thereafter, Rodulfus Glaber, Otlo of St. Emmeran, Peter the Venerable, Orderlic Vitalis, Giraldus Corumbensis, among numerous other tales involving great armies of ghosts or congregations of ghosts. And in many of these tales, those very ghosts are tormented by the various implements of war that they donned in life. They are roasting inside their red heart armor. They grab the monk and it burns their throat. The spears in their hands torment them, and they bear the wounds of the sinful rampages they once undertook, sometimes against monasteries. Thus, here we have a most fascinating combination. On the one hand, such appearances of vast wraith armies are very likely an expression of the older pagan wild hunt idea led variously by Woden and in some cases by Diana, with Diana astride a beast forming the core of the journey of the Witches' Sabbath some centuries later on, and its enshrinement of that tale in the Canon Episcopi. So here we have a jaunt off into witchcraft territory. But combined with these Christian elements, this pagan story combined with Christian elements, specifically purgatorial punishments after death. Thus we have both pagan and Christian elements both in the service of the resurrection of the Central and Northern European warrior ghost narratives. It's just breathtaking syncretism. Such historical, cultural, and religious shifts would open the doors to dozens, if not hundreds, of such medieval ghostly narratives, and the survival of otherwise pagan ghost narratives from Viking sagas, Arthurian legends, and tales of haunted monasteries and castles, originating primarily to inspire earthly repentance and redemption among the faithful, but those very stories would eventually go on to form the nucleus of what would become the Gothic that we all know and love. Once banished by St. Augustine, it would be paganism and Christian syncretism which would usher in a litany of monastic and warrior ghost visitations from their purgatorial tortures. And I have to tell you, these medieval ghost stories are just fantastic to read, even if we're probably reading them for the wrong reasons now. But by the Renaissance, not only had ghosts seen a full-blown resurgence, but the recovery of ancient pagan wisdom had opened the door to a range of new supernatural entities aside from angels,
Oh, I'm gonna
demons,
have
and
another
souls of the
slice
dead.
of smoked
Well,
salmon, if you
new
don't
to them.
mind.
They were old pagan ideas. Various celestial and elemental spirits, along with other such entities, would now populate the occult works of Ficino, Agrippa, Paracelsus, Bruno, and Dr. John Dee, among many others. And in the midst
John
of this
Dee, he's a
occult
pretty interesting
revolution,
figure.
Western Christianity was simply tearing itself asunder. Storming out of Germany, the Protestant movement sought a return to a more primitive and thus pure form
He was
of
a court
Christianity,
wizard
and
during
decisively with
Elizabeth
Catholicism
I's
on a
reign,
number of
and
theological
he was
issues. One
supposedly
of those
supposedly one of the
rejected by
first
the Protestants
spies,
was, of course,
and he was the guy who
concept
coined the term
of
007,
purgatory.
which is
Simply
also a
put,
reference to a
Protestants
biblical
rejected this
figure.
conception as unbiblical and thus unchristian. It was an innovation on the part of the Catholic
Let's
Church
see.
that was tantamount to paganism.
Gonna have another
But this
slice.
rejection of purgatory created a problem for the Protestants. If ghosts aren't souls on vacation from the realm of purgatory, I guess they're not exactly vacation, but at any rate, if they're not away from purgatory because there isn't simply a purgatory in the first place, then what explains the commonplace appearance of ghosts? What are they exactly, and how do they fit into the emergent
Ghosts,
purgatory-free
what are
Protestant
they?
religious cosmology? And it's this kind of question and the ensuing other theological and metaphysical issues around ghosts that so vexes Ludwig Lavater into composing what became, probably I would suspect, the most important and most influential textbook
I think I'll
on
draw a
ghosts
guy
in
playing
European
DDR.
history.
At least he's on a
His
DDR
book,
map,
De
because
Spectris on Ghosts,
I
first
assume
published
that
in
in
German
every
in
convention there is
1769
always
before
some
being
form of
translated
DDR
into
going on.
Latin, French, English, Dutch, and Italian, and then going into about 20 editions. 20 editions makes it, without doubt, one of the most popular and most influential books on ghosts in European history. It's fantastic to read, and you can even read it in an early modern English edition. A Swiss Reformed theologian, Lavater's De Spectris is divided into three sections. The first is where he establishes the reality of spiritual or spectral manifestation, the second where he presents arguments about exactly what these beings are, and the third, of course, about the correct and proper means by which a Christian, a Protestant, can be rid of these spectral bothers. The third part is the most boring. You just pray and fast. That's it. For Lavater, these beings are almost just always demons tormenting people, and in this way, he's actually really close to back to Augustine. In rare cases, they might be angels, but God very rarely sends angels anymore because since the coming of Christ and the Reformed Church, of course, God has basically communicated all that we need to know, so you don't need to have an angel show up and tell you anything new. Finally, in some rarer cases, God might send the spirit of a dead person from some very specific task, but Lavater is slow to admit that this happens much at all. Why not just send an angel or something else? Thus, we come back full circle to Augustine in the form of a Swiss Protestant. Didn't see that coming. But the first part of Lavater's book is especially interesting. There he writes at length about what we might call pseudo-ghosts. That is to say, a range of physical and psychological disorders that may cause one to experience something like a ghost or a haunting. There he discusses at length how insomnia through sickness, but especially through grief, can induce hallucinations. This point about grief-induced ghost hallucinations is now well attested by psychologists. In fact, one study by the researcher Agneta Gremba at the University of Göteborg found that over 80% of elderly people, 80% of elderly people experience hallucinations associated with their dead partner 1 month or so after bereavement. Thus, such grief hallucinations aren't the exception. They appear to be the rule, or they're not hallucinations. They're just spirits of the dead that hang around a bit before moving on. Either way, Lavater is an important early witness to just this phenomenon. He's also an important early witness in the pages of this book to the reality of night terrors. In such a state, people often experience paralysis and yet are keenly, horrifyingly aware of nearby malevolent entities. Such entities may simply malinger around, but can also
Just
seem
blew
to
his head off right in the middle of it.
them, sometimes sexually.
Shotgun and just blew his
Such
head off
night
right in the
terrors,
middle of it.
Lavater argues, form the basis for the mythology around incubi and succubi tales. In fact, such narratives go back to our earliest literature on ghosts in Mesopotamia. Of course, mental illness, cowardice, drunkenness, and even hallucination induced by psychoactive drugs can cause us to perceive that we're seeing
So
ghosts.
I kind of want to
He
fill out
even
the
makes
space
mentions of certain
here
types
and
of
maybe something
fumigations, which
here.
can cause people around a table to appear to have no heads, or the heads of donkeys, or strange vines growing all over the ceiling. This is getting creepy. Yeah, vines growing up around the ceiling, and he even makes mentions of books about just such drugs. And I suspect
I'll
that
just
he's
draw a
actually
guy in a
making
banana suit.
sideways reference to
I'm sure
Giovanni
that
della
counts as
Sforza's
cosplay of some
Book
sort.
of Natural Magic, which contains just such recipes. And you don't want to look them up, and you definitely don't want to try them because they are poisonous with like henbane and stuff. Yes, you don't need to be ingesting belladonna, God. But I want to notice here something that Lavater is introducing that is a fundamentally modern element into this conversation around ghosts. That such experiences can be the result of physiological, especially psychological factors. And we're now opening onto the vista of ghosts and hauntings being manifestation of not only supernatural phenomena or theological phenomena, but interior states of our own body, even of consciousness itself. And this psychologizing of the spectral world sets the stage of everything from a similar move in theories of magic by people like the early Aleister Crowley or Israel Regardie to psychoanalytic theories of both ghosts and hauntings, but also demonic possession. And in many ways, if you think about a classic about hauntings in the modern era, Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House is exactly interested in just this question. Thus, Lavater looks in two directions at once, theologically back into the past, back to the primitive Christianity of St. Augustine, but also forward to us, to ghosts as kinds of psychological pathology in some ways. And I think this idea has had a tremendous impact on ghosts in modernity and in contemporary times. Of course, the Catholics weren't going to go down without a fight on this whole ghost business, and the Counter-Reformation would answer such claims, especially in texts like Peter Thureus' 1598 book,
Well,
Loca
let's
and
try
Festa,
this.
along with other theological works of his. In fact, Thureus is just one of the most important demonologists of this period, and his works remain decisively important and sadly lacking contemporary translations and editions. It's a common problem we have here or in esoterica land. But like
Maybe he's better off
Lavater,
here.
Thureus surveys the vast amount of literature on hauntings and concludes reasonably that the existence overwhelmingly suggests the existence of ghosts and supernatural infestation. In fact, that language of infestation, loca and festa, stems from warfare. It's literally demonic and ghostly sieges of Christendom, which you also imagine he thinks of the Protestants as laying siege to Christendom too. And what follows is a detailed analysis of just how supernatural beings do things like create sounds and manifest in divisions, toss things around, or even if they know that they're dead. He's inclined to believe that most of them are aware of their condition of being deceased. For Thureus, spirits do have some limited ability to affect the physical world, which is interesting considering that they're made of a spiritual substance, not a physical one, that presents some Thomistic issues.
Another
But most
slice
them
of
operate
smoked
primarily
salmon.
through inducing hallucinations in their victims, which is somehow even more terrifying than just being able to see them. I would just rather see a ghost in my house than them somehow be able to manipulate my mind into hallucinating them. At any rate, he further distinguishes between three types of haunters. Haunters who are ghosts of the dead, haunters who are of course demons, or what he calls spirits unattached. Demons should be relatively straightforward. But the first category are largely those out of purgatory, as we might expect, but he does allow for a really strange exception in all this. Thureus actually argues that God can and often does allow people to undergo purgation of sins in the locale
I think I'll have
in which
another
that
slice.
sin occurred. You kind of have to live with it. Thus, places on earth, especially where sins occur, like homes, of course, become site of purgatorial torture, and thus the groans, cries, and angry manifestations of the dead that we hear are actually them suffering in purgatory in our house. Now, how this is fair to the living who are living in their purgatorial torture isn't clear, but perhaps such hauntings are again reminders to us that we should avoid a similar fate through being good Catholics. Finally, Thureus admits of a third set of entities known as unattached spirits, but these are mostly quasi-demonic, but some of them just bothersome, a bit like the classic poltergeist or noisy ghosts. These entities seem to haunt various spaces, from homes, ruins, and especially places like mines, and mostly just bother and scare people, mostly with strange sounds, rapping on walls, and moving things about. They're
Just a nuisance in
bothersome
general.
spirits, like brownies, for instance. Thureus doesn't exactly detail these beings. He gives examples of such as Lares, the brownies, as specific examples that haunt homes, but Lavater has a similar minor demonic category which he denotes as kobolds, goblins, and also it's worth mentioning that both accept to varying degrees a scenario where demonic infestation can be induced through sorcery and witchcraft. Yes, sorcerers and witches can curse your home and invite demons and ghosts into your house.
The
So that
bastards.
makes them angry. So we have ghosts, demons, witches, and goblins.
There we go. That's
Getting
filled up
real
quite
close
nicely.
To a D&D adventure here, folks. You need to roll for initiative.
I might put
Thanks,
something over
early
here,
modernity.
maybe in this corner.
Honestly, Thureus' Opera Omnia would just be a fantastic project for a
Oh.
graduate student to translate.
I'll have
Nudge,
another
nudge,
slice of
nudge,
smoked salmon
or at
and
least
think
his
over this.
demonological work specifically. But again, what's key about these developments is that we're beginning to see
Ooh, I might
some
need to
sense
get
of a
more wasabi to put on my
freelance
smoked
ghost,
salmon.
freelance demons as a kind of spirit not especially contained within the
How do you
traditional
eat your
Christian
smoked salmon?
spiritual
Like I
ecosystem.
said, I eat it like
These
sashimi with
unattached
wasabi and
spirits
soy
or
sauce,
goblins
with
are kind of
chopsticks as well.
becoming their own hustlers, doing their side gigs. And as such, this all sets the stage for a kind of secular demonology or theory of ghosts and hauntings as we transition into the modern and contemporary world of spirits. We're getting something like secular ghosts for the first time. But finally, let's turn to the Enlightenment, that period where
Grab another
rationalism and
slice.
empiricism allegedly beat back superstition, religion, and magic, resulting in the disenchanted world that we all live in now. Another mythology widely indulged in, and not true. But from one
This world
Augustus
really do
to
be
another, we
disenchanted and
conclude with the
she.
French historian, theologian, and vampirologist Antoine Augustin Calmet, whose 1746, then greatly expanded 1751 dissertation, then treatise on apparitions and vampires, was
Cool.
probably the most influential textbook on those subjects, especially the vampire part, at that time and a great deal afterwards. Now, I've done a whole episode on the vampire part of that book if you're interested in that topic, because of course you are. Everyone's interested in vampires. But like all of the literature before, Calmet's
Freaking
text is basically
vampires.
a giant survey of ghost stories.
Freaking hate
And
them.
that's part of the reason why this literature is just perennially interesting. Everyone loves ghost stories.
So
But
I'm
these
just getting
reach
rid of
back
the
all the way
tweeting
into
there,
antiquity
or
through the Middle Ages and
interpolation
even
as it's
through
also known.
research. But despite being a Benedictine abbot, Calmet's methodology, skeptical even, and being a child
So
of the
what I want to
Enlightenment,
do
is as
is
scientific as one could be in as many
highlight
words.
everything here.
He seeks out to
I'll save it
understand
in
such
case something goes
specters
wrong,
using
and then
advances
over here in this
physics,
frame I will
chemistry,
paste
biology,
that.
and even the same source of the kind of criticism being developed at
Okay,
that
we're getting
time
somewhere.
for biblical studies. He uses source criticism to analyze ghost stories to see whether or not they actually
And by doing this, I can.
For instance, when he analyzes the reports of vampires rising from their graves and devouring the blood of their victims, he primarily wishes to rely on the reports of medical doctors rather than just folklore stories. He tends to think the medical doctors are giving him a more
Put this
scientific
here.
approach. Indeed, he puzzles with those doctors over how such beings could stalk their victims nocturnally, and yet the earth over their graves goes undisturbed. His position vis-a-vis ghosts
me
and
a
apparitions is
second.
actually very similar. While he accepts that many of these accounts may be true, his position is one of relative likelihood
Do
rather than
that.
dogmatic acceptance or theological appropriation. He says this one tends to sound a bit more likely to be true than all of these more fantastical ones. And while he might conclude that denial of all apparitions is tantamount to a denial of Christianity itself, it was just a bridge
Copy
too far
that.
for him to say
Go back
there
to
are no
this
such
frame.
things as apparitions. He was also skeptical enough that Voltaire,
Delete that.
yes,
And
Voltaire,
over
the
here.
cheerleader of the Enlightenment, would rely on Calmet for his encyclopedia entry on the subject of vampires.
And in between, I'll
Thus,
go
Calmet, like the other
to
figures we've explored, looked in two directions at
draw
once.
mode,
Back
draw,
into the
interpolate
theological world of
sequence.
pre-modernity, and yet
Some
also into
weirdo
the
brought a
future
shotgun
of
and just blew.
rationalism, empiricism, and scientific
Well,
naturalism.
some weirdo brought a
One might
shotgun
even
and just
say
blew his
that
head
it
off
was
right in the middle of
Calmet
it.
that
There we go, that's
shepherded
pretty much what I
ghosts
wanted.
through the perils of
Hell
the
yeah.
Enlightenment.
It
Indeed,
all
he's the
worked out.
grandfather of all contemporary paranormal researchers skulking through ruins, attempting to bring science to bear on the ancient world of the restless.
I think
Ghosts,
that warrants
therefore,
another
have
slice
kind
of smoked salmon
double
just to
history,
celebrate,
their
because
own
I am so glad it
personal
all worked
history for
out.
their transformation into apparitions, but also ghosts as such have a history. One very much subject to the ebbs and flows of cultural, religious, scientific, and social transformations. And in this sense, the seemingly timeless ghosts all turn out to be profoundly historically mediated entities. And by studying ghosts as, at least in part, a product of that historical change, we learn about that process and we learn about us, and about how seemingly timeless religious, philosophical, or metaphysical conceptions are anything other than timeless. They are, as Hegel reminds us, an expression of history. Of course, the literature on ghosts is just
I also want to work on the
staggering
backgrounds on these
but I'm going to include
frames.
some useful resources in the description if you want a reading list on ghosts, because of course you do. I'm sure I'm not done with the topic, so
Oops.
definitely more on ghosts here in the future. Till then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane
Thanks, Dr. Justin
history,
Sledge.
philosophy,
could also just draw some like people in the background. There we go, that's close enough. I think that's a good enough approximation of a person in the distance. Let's try this next video.
In 1605, a man made a pact with the devil to gain vast wealth. But of course, the trick was on him, it always is, and he was subsequently possessed by said demon. A semi-public exorcism would follow, with lay people heaping on their prayers for deliverance from this diabolical scourge. And on the morning of the 4th Tuesday of January, they had success. The demon went forth from the man like a blast of fire out of a cannon. It allegedly even deafened one of the exorcist's assistants, followed by another roar which shook nearby homes. This was no ordinary exorcism. Not only does the description use the imagery of cannon fire tell us that we are squarely in modernity, but this specific exorcism was performed by Protestants on a Protestant, a French Huguenot. In the battlefield of early modernity, Catholics and Protestants battled for religious supremacy, not only in words, but also in literal field combat, but at least for our purposes, also in their shared war against the forces of Satan. Indeed, whoever could demonstrate their ability to defeat the devil in exorcism could rest triumphant that the Lord was indeed on their side, and their shared common weapon in that fight was the ritual of exorcism. But Catholics and Protestants now face the devil not only in the poor souls of those possessed, but most horribly in the greatest foe in the history of Christendom, the witch. How did these early modern exorcists battle what they took to be the forces of darkness? And how did their tools and techniques actually become themselves nothing short of heretical magic, banned by the very church that they sought to serve? Make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica for weekly explorations of topics in esoteric history. And if you'd like to support this work of providing evidence-backed, free, and accessible content and topics in esotericism, I'd hope you consider checking out my Patreon, where you can support my work there, or pick up some of the cool merch that we have on the channel. If you're new to the study of esotericism and you just want to get the lay of the land from reliable sources, make sure to check out my study guide to Western esotericism. And if you're interested in actually owning historical books on topics in the occult and the mystical, check out our bookstore at Esoterica Rare Books. You can find all of those links down in the description and in the pinned comment below. But now, let's turn to the intersection of modernity, exorcisms, heresy, and the witch hunts. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. You might be surprised to learn that prior to the Council of Trent, which ran from 1545 to 1563, really about 1614 in this case, there was no standard ritual for major exorcism. And this makes a bit of sense if you think about it. Each case was pretty different. The faith of the person possessed, the purity of the priest, the quality and quantity of the demons involved, and other mitigating circumstances meant that the ritual of exorcism often required as much charisma on the part of the exorcist as it did improvisation on part of the entire theatrics of the ritual. But with the Protestant Reformation, the aberrant use of exorcistic formulae and necromancy, a marked uptick in possession cases, printing, that, the rise of dangerously
Oops.
invasive exorcistic practices, and the apocalyptic arrival of the witch heresy, the once varied rites and rituals of casting out demons came under greater official scrutiny, clarification, and standardization by the early modern Catholic Church. However, this process was pretty slow in coming. The most popular exorcism manual of the early years of printing was a text called the Conjuratio Malignorum Spiritum, appearing three times in printing before 1500, and then again in 1501 and 1510. This relatively brief manual, it's only about 14 folios, organized exorcism into 26 separate stages. And like prior rituals, it was based on the minor exorcism achieved at baptism, but supplemented with some traditional exorcistic prayers, ultimately culminating in 6 conjurations to banish the devil in the name of the
Seven.
Trinity, in the name of the Passion, the keys of St. Peter, the spear that pierced the side of Jesus, the death and burial of Jesus, the resurrection, and of course the ascension of Jesus.
Oh my god, I can't believe it's been one
Of
whole
course,
hour.
the association of this manual with St. Peter and its use in a famous Vatican exorcism gave it some, but not ultimate authority. But the text wasn't so much connected to more medieval exorcistic traditions, and thus, while it was the first to print, it wouldn't ultimately prove terribly enduring. And yes, that language of conjuratio, conjuration, and adjuration actually betrays the shared no man's land between exorcism and magic, and I've covered that topic in a whole other video. You can find that link below, but the logic is pretty simple here. Exorcism using language and rituals of power to bind and cast out demons. Solomonic necromancy basically does the same bit of binding, but simply, puts the demon to work, answering questions, building the temple, finding buried treasure, telling the future, or whatever. In a sense, Solomonic necromancy was just hacking the exorcism ritual. And as we'll see, many of the most popular printed exorcism manuals were used for both licit and illicit ends, like the same picks that you might find in the kit of a locksmith and in the kit of a thief alike. Further, the elaborate rituals of necromantic textbooks, including the use of Latin incantations, astrological knowledge, and access to the often elaborate accessories required for the conjuration of demons, would actually only be accessible to someone from the clerical class. Only they really had that kind of know-how. Thus, we have the famed, or at least around here, the famed clerical necromantic underground. Priest exorcists by day, metal necromancers by night. And this reputation of priests peddling superstitious demonology would become a classic Protestant attack on Catholicism. Their rituals were just superstitions at best and magic at worst, but of course they were always in service of the Antichrist Pope. However, it's ironically from the pen of a Catholic, Erasmus, that many of these anti-Catholic tropes would first emerge. In his 1524 The Exorcism or Apparition, he has a certain Anselm-related tale whereby a prankster named Polus tricks an arrogant exorcist priest named Faunus into exorcising a haunted churchyard that's being haunted by a tormented soul from purgatory. And Polus fakes the haunting with him moaning in the background and even sending candles atop the backs of crabs for added spooky special effects. Of course, the exorcism is successful, so much so that the priest touts even getting a letter from the soul in purgatory thanking them for alleviating their suffering. Yeah, that was a trope at that time. People claimed that that really happened. Of course, Erasmus is himself poking fun at what he took to be the abuses of the credulous superstitions of his day. Now, for his part, he actually took the occult pretty seriously and even corresponded briefly with Cornelius Agrippa, recommending one of his students to be connected with Agrippa. And to be sure, there were definitely Catholic critiques of not only these superstitions, but also the chaotic, illicit, and often heretical, even abusive nature of exorcisms of their day. But Protestants took such mockery as just endemic of Catholicism more generally, and Protestant theologians such as Benedict
For my
Marty
first
or
convention, I'm
Helgius
actually having a
noted
really
that
great time
Jesus
hanging out.
himself never used any
Yeah,
elaborate rites and rituals. rather than just simple commands, and faith alone were sufficient for Jesus' exorcisms. Good enough for JC, should be good enough for y'all. And Ludwig Lavater, in his book on ghosts, which I've actually done a whole episode on his fantastic book.
I'll be right back. I'm gonna get more
also
wasabi.
just argued that ghosts themselves were just either illusions, delusions, or in very rare cases, demonic infestations for which prayer and fasting were the only real remedy. Yeah, I know, but just because it's boring doesn't make it not true, with all due respect to the Protestants. But what Catholics and Protestants agreed upon was that they were both locked into an apocalyptic battle with Satan, who had recently released a final and most horrible heresy upon the world: witches and witchcraft.
Ooh, that cake is still in my
But in a sense,
fridge. It's really
both
tempting
camps
me.
shared very
I might
much
get it
in
after
common demonologies,
I finish the
despite all
salmon.
of their many other differences. And as I mentioned, the Protestants, for their part, relied primarily on the invisible power of fasting, prayer, and scripture. Of course, with a lot of faith. I mean, they are Protestants. Faith is a big deal here, along with very simple improvised exorcisms to deal with demons that possess
Just
people.
squeezed
Of course,
some
they had
wasabi
lethal
out.
judicial
Some
procedures
genuine
to deal with
Japanese
witches, and if you
wasabi,
wanna
might I
glimpse
add.
into the very Protestant response to witchcraft,
SMB
you can
brand.
check out my episode in collaboration with Attaché Films on King James's infamous 1597 book, The Demonology. But in mixed arenas, Catholics and Protestants were sometimes in a kind of duel to prove the legitimacy of their movement by dual claims laid on their respective exorcistic powers. And this was especially true in France. The most famous case probably was the 16-year-old girl Nicole Aubry, who was exorcised twice a day from November of 1565 to February of 1566, with only a consecrated host diminishing her seizure-like symptoms, much to the horror of the Huguenots. She would publicly declare that she was possessed by none other than Beelzebub, who was the leader of the Huguenots according to her, that the host truly was the
I might add
body
in
of
some like
Christ,
booths in the
and that when
background.
the spirits fled her body, they returned to Geneva. The spirits lived in Protestant Geneva. This wasn't just exorcism, it was political theology made theatrical. With the possession of Nicole Aubry, the main possession cases at convents like Loudun, and especially rising authority of printed works, the first important Catholic exorcism manuals would arrive in this period. The most famous and infamous of those would be the 1577 Flagellum Daemonum, the Fustis Daemonum of 1584, and the Eversio Daemonum of 1588, all by the exorcistic superstar, the Italian Franciscan friar Girolamo Manghi, whose vernacular text actually in 1572, the Compendium of the Exorcist's Art, was the first true complete exorcism manual to ever appear in print. Indeed, it would really be the Franciscans that would lead the charge in the production of exorcistic literature and its defense. But at the core of Menghi's theology was exorcism is fused with apocalypticism. That is, that these were the final days, and the devil was bringing out the big guns as a final outrage against God before he was put off into the outer darkness.
Man, if there
In
was
his
like a
works, demons
booth
are even
offering
tactile,
fat-titted
even
cat girls at a
visceral.
convention,
Take that.
if I ever go to a convention, I would
And many
definitely
of the forms
be
of
making a beeline towards it.
demonology are informed by learned scholars as much as just popular belief. Various ranks of demons confront, possess, and heredicate believers and must be confronted through a wide range of techniques, including using the sacraments, using sacramentals such as blessed objects and relics, etc., and even suffumigations to attack the demonic forces. Menghi also held that demonic infestation could also be caused by witchcraft, and thus the bedding of the accused should be searched continuously and sanctified, with any items of witchcraft ceremonially destroyed. Like previous manuals, he stressed the importance of the moral and spiritual purity of the exorcist, but his conjurations were often left open-ended in a sense, and with pocket-sized editions proving very popular, it was only a matter of time until his exorcism manuals were used to conjure demons. There's even a 1643 case where there was a monk
Actually,
named
it's more like a
Zorzi who
table.
was actually caught using Mingi's book, the Flagellum Daemonum, to actually conjure demons and to make amulets to aid him in gambling. But I mean, his name was also Zorzi, so the dude was, he was definitely born to be a wizard anyway. I mean, can you blame the guy? This magical use of exorcism manuals would continue with manuals like Stampa's 1597 Fuga Satanae, Get Lost Satan, even featuring writing demonic and witches' names on images, then on paper, and then burning, clearly rituals closer to folk magic than traditional exorcisms. Indeed, it would be Fuga Satanae that would truly combine counter witchcraft, exorcism, and quasi magic like techniques into one system of 19 steps, 10 of which could be skipped in cases of just potential possession, mere obsession, or bewitchment, by which different aspects of possession, obsession, or bewitchment could be treated almost like a medical flowchart, if you've ever seen those. These were novel incantations. Stampa really didn't rely on medieval liturgy. Rather, modern possessions required modern solutions and could even include breaking the instruments of witchcraft using rituals like burning them with sulfur and pitch, which were first blessed with holy
Pitch,
water. I guess
please.
you gotta douse it with the water before you burn. Exorcisms of various objects were included, including personal suffumigation, and domestic exorcism became a big deal during this period, a rite that really first appears in this time period and continues down to this day in the Catholic Church. However, it would be the Jesuit Peter Thraseus' 1604 Locis Infestis that proved to be the definitive Counter-Reformation guide to hauntings and the exorcisms of homes, using various scriptures and, of course, incense, suffumigation. So take that, Protestant Ludwig Lavater. There are rituals for getting rid of ghosts in houses that do require elaborate Catholic rituals. Speaking of incense, by the way, Polidori's Practica Exorcistarum of 1587 actually provide one of the most exacting recipes for driving out the devil and ghosts. 6 drams of hypericum, rue, frankincense against evil spirits specifically, and then 1 dram of frankincense, dore, galbanum, laudanum, and garofilum with 2 grams
Laudanum?
of musk against
That's an
bewitchment,
opiate
all
tincture.
specifically blessed with holy water and various incantations. I don't recommend that you make those instances. Demons apparently really dislike rue in these texts especially. Other more aggressive fumigations also included sulfur and asafoetida, which are known to have caused serious injury and even death to the people suffering from possession. Polidori provides medical-like knowledge for diagnosing the difference between bewitchment and possession using physical symptoms such as changes in skin color, paralysis of various parts of the body, and the manifestation of objects in and from the body, like balls traveling up from the stomach into the throat. Body horror.
Don't think that's gonna
While
work.
some of the procedures border on the magical, to say the very least, Polidori, like all exorcistic manuals, expressly
Meow, meow, meow.
forbid using sorcery to counter sorcery or demonic infestation. Of course, the Protestants are over there like, perhaps the most important incantation shared among these exorcists was the famed one of Saint Anthony, Ecce crucum domine partes adversae, livi Deo de tribu Juda radix David, alleluia, alleluia. Again, said to have been provided to Saint Anthony miraculously, and it's still said today. In fact, Pope Sixtus V, I believe, placed this prayer at the base of his obelisk there in St. Peter's Square. So it's like exorcising all of Vatican City. Van Einaten's 1619 Manuale Exorcismorum is perhaps one of the more sober manuals of this period, urging faith and fasting, of course, but also consulting a doctor before beginning what could be an ongoing and invasive regime of exorcism. But he argues that demons can be seen entering the body sometimes in the form of insects or mice or even freezing blasts of wind. Then, like other manuals, he lays out the spiritual and physical symptoms of obsession, possession, and bewitchment over and above mere medical maladies. I mean, you can't fix demons with doctors. Akhenaten urges public exorcism in a church, though no spectators allowed. You gotta be helping, especially women and children, because they're so prone to being possessed. While he allows some amulets, anything
Women
again
do be like that.
smacking of sorcery should be avoided. The
They
Protestants
certainly
are
do.
still staring in disgust. Providing numerous exorcism rituals, the Manuale notes that the demon may exit the
let's
body
see.
also in the form of an
Getting all
animal,
possessed by
insect,
demons
or
and
even
shit.
drops of blood from the nose, and also, as we said earlier, as a booming flame of fire from the mouth, from the nose, the eyes, the heart, or the stomach.
Let's
Various
see.
liturgies are provided in staged recourse for dealing with bewitchment, obsession, and possession, and including everything from how to cure visitations from incubi and succubi, along with exorcisms to protect homes, cattle, crops, food, and even shoo away demons in the form of agricultural pests. Note that the scope of the exorcisms here continues to widen given the apocalyptic worldview of the exorcists. Evil is simply everywhere. Another shared sensibility again,
Evil do
between
be
Protestants
everywhere.
and Catholics, especially Protestants and Catholics
And
in
shit.
the New World. And yep, there's going to be an upcoming episode
Let's
about
see.
exorcisms in the New World. These various Franciscan manuals were eventually brought together and printed in the infamous
excuse
collection
me.
called the Tresoris Exorcismorum. The
All this
Treasure
drawing
House
is
of
hard work.
Exorcisms,
It's so
in
hard being an
1608
artist.
by Zetzner, who was really the coolest printer of that time.
Being
in
an
terms
artist
of
is
occult
so
stuff.
hard.
This only expanded their already considerable influence. But
Yeah,
as
I'm
I
glad to
noted earlier, the Franciscans were
Hell
pretty
yeah.
gung-ho about developing and deploying a huge range of exorcistic rituals and techniques. Yeah, but the Dominicans and the Jesuits were increasingly skeptical
Do a
of
quick
the
save.
orthodoxy, the morality, and even the necessity of all of these procedures. Again, we shouldn't think of the church as a kind of monolith, and there were real ecclesiastical divisions on this
Oh,
front,
shit.
along with many others. And as I mentioned, Dominican inquisitors finding Franciscan exorcism manuals being used in necromantic demon conjuration, that wasn't a good look, Franciscans. Further, exorcisms could and did result in physical and even sexual harm up to and including death. They still do. Those Germans killed that poor girl through an exorcism. Finally, theologians and philosophers like Suarez even question the fundamental nature of demons, greatly undermining the metaphysics and thus the practical reality of dealing with demons the way these manuals said they should be dealt with. For instance, the demonologist Martin Del Rio, whose 1599 Investigations into
Del
Magic,
Rio.
an episode about it, is probably the greatest work on the occult from the pre-modern period. He just rejected that physical substance could have any effect on non-physical entities like demons, thus undermining so much of the quasi-magical elements of all of these Franciscan exorcistic rituals. Simply put, given this explosion in exorcism cases, the problematic nature of the manuals being produced, the church sought a unified solution as part of the larger Trentian reforms. What would emerge would be the liturgical reforms of exorcism in 1614, specifically the creation of the modern exorcism ritual in the Roman ritual, which was itself much, much more based on medieval texts and the foundations of minor exorcism associated with baptism. This is incredibly important because it was a clear rejection of the more quasi-magical rituals promulgated over there by the Franciscans. However, it shouldn't be thought that the 1614 ritual was just imposed upon all Catholics the worldwide. Indeed, these more magical manuals would continue to be printed, even though some of them would eventually end up on the Index of Prohibited Books. Yeah, exorcism manuals often got forbidden by the church because they were just magic. The 1614 ritual did maintain the need for the moral and spiritual purity of the exorcist, something not even really required for administering the sacrament of baptism, and thus elevated an otherwise lowly position in the priesthood of the church to something of a spiritual hero fighting demons. Guidelines were then laid out to protect the energumen or the possessed person, especially from overly intrusive or frankly downright abusive exorcisms, but also the exorcist was not to engage in non-essential dialogue with the possessing demon. You couldn't ask them what their favorite color was. By the way, that's advice from 1614 that modern exorcists still happily ignored to this day. It did allow for the possibility of bewitchment and the ritual destruction of bewitching elements, however.
What would a demon's favorite color be?
Far more
I imagine it depends on the
traditional. I'm going to
demon.
be doing a whole episode on the fundamental origins of exorcistic prayers in sort of the medieval world. But this established the powers of Christ and the apostles to cast out demons, the deprecatory and imperative prayers, the threefold great adjurations. Yep, that language is still there, but this is all a return to still more medieval style exorcisms with prayers like Deus Cali and followed by creedal formulas like the Nicene Creed and a bunch of psalms. The 1614 exorcism of the Roman ritual was really a return to the more ancient traditions of the church. Now, of course, it was still way too liturgical for the Protestants, but it was much obviously less connected to the magic of the manuals of the great demonic surge of the prior century. It was both liturgically powerful, spiritually robust, but also flexible to the needs of the situation. And this balanced approach probably helps to explain why it was one of the longest enduring rituals of the modern Catholic Church, not really undergoing revision until 1999 and not totally replaced.
Gonna have
not
another
really
slice
even
of smoked
replaced
salmon
in an essential
because I have
way
been working so
until
hard on this.
2004. But as I mentioned, the Roman ritual wasn't just forced onto exorcists, and other rites continued to be both
Ooh, I
published
think for my
and
next stream I
employed
might
after
open up
1614,
one of my
like Hilaria
Christmas
Necroessus,
presents. I got a Lego
1639,
Technic set,
Exorcis
and I
Mariam,
thought
which
that would be a
actually
good thing
contains
to
liturgical
put together on
exorcisms to be
stream.
used on the various
That'd be pretty
feast
cool. I
days
might do that
throughout
tomorrow,
the Catholic liturgical
depending on
year.
my mood.
That's more than half the year.
Depending
Not even the
on how
oncoming
sleepy I'm
assault of
feeling.
the Enlightenment could stop the publication of these
I think that'll be pretty
amazing
dope.
exorcism manuals, and perhaps my favorite of them is actually this one. This is one of the post-1614 manuals, the 2-volume Armamentarium Ecclesiasticum, printed in 1726 by Stoiber, but running into several editions until around 1757. In fact, it continued to be printed even after it was officially banned by the church on the 11th of March, 1754. Stoiber's work has a kind of medieval feeling to it, making it all the more Gothic as it became popular at just the crest of the Enlightenment. And one wonders what role it might have played in the development of
Who brought a
Romantic
shotgun and just blew
theology and
his head off
Gothic sensibilities more generally. They would have had access to
So
this.
around here.
But the work has the superficial layout of a medieval treatise in the famous disputation or quodlibettal form, where by Stoiber asks and then proceeds to answer various questions on issues of demonology, witchcraft, obsession, and possession. Though rarely does he go into the full, quite tiresome medieval disputation method in full. The first volume affirms the reality of demonic evil and the heroic role of the exorcist in combating the devil. Thus he lays out the qualifications proper to an exorcist, the parameters proper to the ritual of exorcism, and the various tools that may be employed to combat the forces of Satan. Secondly, the volume then outlines the nature of the
I'm gonna do
energumen of
something
the
radical
possessed
and
person
add
and how
a new color
they,
to this.
too, must come to resist the forces of darkness. In this sense, the possessed person isn't just a passive recipient of the exorcism, and the exorcist must pastorally aid them and thereon struggle against this demonic invasion. But Stoiber's focus
let's
is
see.
always
So
clear,
maybe like that.
even on his many demonological tangents, which are lovely, hence the relative thickness of this book. The clear purpose is the actual performance of exorcism, especially the tools and techniques available to the exorcist, hence the name of the text, the armaments of the church. And in this way, the text is radically modern, very much born of the instrumental reason of the Enlightenment, yet underwritten by a wholly medieval spiritual ecology. And I have to say, that's part of the reason why I find this text just so fascinating. The second volume treats in 6 questions various topics dealing with the intersection of demonology and bewitchment and their specific treatments. And this is largely where Stoiber's book veers much more clearly into the realm of something like clerical necromancy. Now, of course, he openly rejects that one should ever use sorcery in order to conflict with the devil, and then he just proceeds to skirt that topic for hundreds of pages. While he sides with Martin Del Rio that you can't expel a demon with pharmaca, you can treat the symptoms of possession and render the host a less inviting domicile for demonic forces. Therefore, he rescues a lot of the suffumigations and things. And this is especially true with the application of the various sacramentals.
Vanilla scented
yes,
candle, maybe?
the use of those various suffumigations, herbs, and even gems on the energumen. He also treats of cases of bewitchment and the use of counter witchcraft, including the ritual destruction of the elements of maleficia, but also basically potions made from holy water used to treat bewitchment. Thus, at least for Stoiber and his audience, witches and witchcraft remained a threat well into the Enlightenment. Finally, there are specific discussions for dealing with hauntings and ghosts, including of various details of various kinds of specters, from delusions and illusions and natural phenomena to magically created specters via glamour, demonic infestation, and spirit visitations from
Off right.
so we're still talking about spirit purgatory visitations. Of course, and also how to cleanse a house and space of such beings. And finally, he treats of dealing with various objects and containers into which demons have become trapped, such as rings and bottles, a clear nod to Solomonic necromancy. The text concludes with a nearly 50-page, all-inclusive exorcism ritual, and finally we have an extended discussion and illustration of several clearly magical amulets that were in use by the exorcist of his time and are described and depicted at length, but we're warned, of course, that such amulets should never be used. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Yeah, here are several clearly
Don't do this thing. I'm
magical
absolutely going to lay out in detail
amulets
for you.
with a 45-page long, one incantation to get them all. Yeah, it's pretty clear why this book was banned by the church. I mean, if this isn't magic, it will do until the magic gets here. But Stoiber's text is fascinating for many reasons, not least of which how it disrupts any easy telling of the myth of how 18th century science and enlightenment just swept magic, possession, demons, and witchcraft and the whole lot of that into the dustbin of disenchantment. And having gone into several editions, Stoiber's book proved popular enough, I dare say. This, in fact, seems to have been one probably used by an exorcist. Now, the study of Western magic is still in its infancy, but no such study of magic or witchcraft, or demonology for that matter, can ever be complete without an intense analysis of the spiritual technology of Western exorcism. Indeed, medieval necromancy, and by extension, much of ceremonial magic, cannot fundamentally be understood outside of the logic and structure of texts like Stoiber. And as I mentioned, the clerical necromancers were the hackers of the spiritual technologies of their day. Both licit exorcists and illicit necromancers were operating within the same fundamental platform. Sadly, most of this exorcistic literature has not been translated. Stoiber has not been translated. It's frankly an embarrassment to the church. I mean, most of it was literally condemned and banned, and many modern occultists aren't really able to appreciate the deeply Catholic admixture that comes into ceremonial magic. So, that cognitive dissonance, though. But Francis Young's History of Exorcism in the Catholic Church is without any doubt the standout volume on this topic and well worth the read. Maggie's book, Satan's Rhetoric, A Study of Renaissance Demonology, is one of the best analyses of some of the exorcistic handbooks that I've covered in this episode, and some of the texts are translated, at least in fragments, in that book. Cacciola's Discerning Spirits, Divine and Demonic Possession in the Middle Ages is also a hugely important study for specifically the medieval period for demonology, And H.A. Kelly's work is great for the development of the concept of, you know, Satan. And Clarke's Thinking with Demons is now just a classic that everyone needs to have read 15 times. Bert Rust's paper is the best and I think the only study of Stoiber up to this point, but sadly basically all of the primary literature remains either untranslated or frankly unreliably translated. But the Latin in these texts is not at all difficult, and I'll put links to these texts down below if you want to check them out and try to read them for yourself. I mean, it's a great way to practice your Latin by casting out ghosts and demons. Of course, more on exorcism and magic and witchcraft to come. Until then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge.
Oh, we're already through the second video. I didn't have another one lined up. Shit.
Explore the arcane, philosophy, and religion.
Let's see. That's nice. Got some things done. Let's see. What else has he covered? Done that one. Done that one. What other ones could we possibly watch?
One of the great spiritual impulses is that by returning.
Give me a second. There we go. Stick this on.
On the 9th of February 1782, the Swiss newspaper Zucker Zeitung issued an award advertisement for the arrest of the maid
1782?
Anna Goldie. She was accused of supernatural poisoning by her employer. Following her arrest and subsequent torture, she was among the last women in Europe to confess to having entered into a pact with Satan, who had appeared to her apparently as a black dog. She would later withdraw her confession. She would be subjected to a humiliating and terrifying trial, and upon conviction, she was executed by beheading, though the law did not strictly allow for capital punishment in non-lethal poisoning cases. Thus, while talk of witchcraft was officially absent from her trial, it haunted and possessed the proceedings. It tainted them with a horrible medieval character well into the days of the so-called Enlightenment, and condemnations rolled in following her execution from jurists all over Europe. This was not justice. This was simply judicial murder. Just a quarter century prior to her killing, at Cologne, the final edition of the vast literature of witch hunting manuals had just come to an end with the 1755 of Martin del Rio's investigations into magic. The horrid Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, had long since gone silent in 1669. Nicolas Ramis de Monolatreya, where he boasted of sending not less than 800 people to the flames, similarly fell silent in 1698. Thus, Del Rio's investigations into magic, while far less known than the Malleus Maleficarum, would prove to be the last true testament to the witch trials that ravaged Europe, finally resulting in their horrifying coda with the execution of Anna Goldie in 1782. However, Martin del Rio's investigations into magic is, without any doubt, not only a truly monumental expression of the great witch trials of the early modern period, but also the greatest analysis of magic and the occult produced in the entirety of the early modern world. From detailed analysis of alchemy and astrology, learned discussions of necromancy and demonic conjurations, dozens examples of folk magic, and anecdotal accounts of magical practices, along with extraordinarily deep discussions of the exact juridical processes by which to investigate, including the application of torture to prosecute and to convict those illicitly enjoining the dark arts. Del Rio's investigations is a monumental work of erudition and scholarship, as learned as it is terrifying. Let's explore this final titanic manual of the witch hunters and the demonologists. Make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica for weekly explorations and topics in esoteric history. And if you'd like to support the work of providing evidence-backed, free, and accessible content like this here on YouTube, I'd hope you consider taking a look at my Patreon page or some of the cool merch that we offer on the channel. And if you're new to the study of esotericism and you want to get the lay of the land, make sure to check out my study guide on specific topics in esotericism. And also, if you're interested in historical books on topics in the occult and the mystical, make sure to check out Esoterica Rare Books. It's my bookstore full of antique, cool old books. You can find all those links in the description and in the pinned comment. But now, let's turn to Martin Del Rio's investigations into magic, the greatest single analysis of witchcraft, magic, and the occult produced in the early modern period. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. The early modern European witch trials produced four fundamental textbooks for understanding that terrifying period. The 1486-87 Malleus Maleficarum of Springer and Institutor, the 1580 De Montmagny of Jean Bodin, the 1595 Demonologiae of Nicolas Remy, followed quickly thereafter by the monumental 1599-1600 Investigations of Magic by Martin Del Rio, in 3 volumes over the course of 6 huge books. Of course, dozens of other such texts were composed during the period of the witch hunts, but these 4 in some ways represent the height of the intellectual, theological, and juridical engines that fundamentally drove the trials. The depraved conspiratorial thinking of someone like Institutor that saw a woman-led heretical witch army threatening all of Christendom drove Institutor to compose the extended rant, basically, of the Malleus. Bodin and Remy stoked the fire by building upon the witch conspiracy by adding a level of verisimilitude to it through a litany of confession after confession after confession, all arrived at through horrifying manipulation and torture. Their textbooks read like a grim chorus. But Del Rio's investigations into magic is above the din and fray in some ways. Del Rio himself was never a witch hunter. He presided over no trials, and he may have never even met an accused witch so far as we know. His work is that of an academic, preferring careful citation of academic, theological, historical, and judicial texts over the kind of rabid screeds or lurid accounts of confessions. The Malleus reads like a fevered raving, a text, frankly, that the church was never totally comfortable with, and in fact even received intermittent interdiction. Institutor himself, the guy who composed this, was actually under exile by a local bishop who thought him sexually obsessed with a local woman and generally demented. He was thought of as crazy by his contemporaries. Bodin and Remy is that of a jurist and judge gathering into single theological and judicial narratives that were frankly extracted through the imposition of agony before their victims were sent to the fiery stake. But what we finally have in Del Rio's investigations into magic, by contrast, can lure us into sounding like the voice of reason, frankly. Now, it isn't the voice of reason, to be sure, but what it surely is the greatest analysis of magic and the occult and the mechanism of the witch trials from the entirety of the early modern period. In fact, if we just physically compare the 2 volumes, here is my copy of Malleus Maleficarum from 1574, printed in Venice. This is the last time the Malleus would actually appear in print by itself. After this, it would tend to travel with other such books like the Formicarius of Johannes Nider. But this is the last edition of the Malleus Maleficarum printed in Venice. Again, printed in 1574, and the last time, like I said, it reprinted by itself. You get some sense of the relative size of the Malleus when you see it actually in a contemporary printing of the 16th century. This book was probably owned by a witch hunter. The notes inside were to make that relatively clear. But it's not a huge hulking volume in the way that you might imagine a copy of a book so lurid and a book of such a terrifying representation. In fact, it looks positively innocuous when you take a look at it in one of these kinds of bindings. But this is the Malleus, with everything that you've heard of that is horrifying about the Malleus. So when you compare the Malleus to a text like Del Rio's Investigations into Magic, you get some sense of what you're dealing with in Del Rio. So this is Del Rio here, and this is Malleus. You get some sense when I say gargantuan, titanic. This is like a baby book compared to what Del Rio has presented. And to be clear, this is not like it's printed in some enormous font or with giant margins. It's actually printed in a similar size 12-point font, double columns with a bit more margin space, but this is an absolutely massive textbook of the occult and magic. And when you get some sense of just how much goes into a book like this, when I tell you that this book is overshadowed, unjustly overshadowed in its importance, in its scholarship, and in its learning by this horrid little volume, you'll see what I mean when I say that this thing, Del Rio's Investigations into Magic, is truly a titanic piece of scholarship. And it is a pity that most people don't know it, even though it is, I said, horrifying in its own way. But it is the case that for sure, the fact that most people have never heard of this book, but they have heard of this one, is a bit of a pity in so many ways when it comes to an analysis of the history of witchcraft and magic. In case you're wondering, the Investigation into Magic was last edited in 1608. That edition is from 1612, just a few years after the death of Del Rio. Now, of course, I have an entire episode on the Malleus Maleficarum if you want to check that out, and I'll be coming back, of course, to do episodes on Bodin's Demomanie and Remy's Demolatreia. Again, perhaps maybe in upcoming years around this spooky time of year. It's an appropriate time to cover witchcraft manuals. But Del Rio wasn't exactly what you'd expect to have composed a textbook on the occult and witch hunting. He was in fact born in an upwardly mobile mercantile Spanish family in Antwerp, and he was actually destined for politics more than anything else. At a young age, however, it became clear that he was a complete genius. He was a child prodigy, and he graduated early at basically everything that he did, and he advanced quickly through every academic rank he could. He composed works ranging from first editions of manuscripts from the Roman writer Silenus, the tragedies of Seneca, biblical commentaries, judicial works, treatises on the Virgin Mary, and the role of classical education on the religious life, specifically the Jesuit life. His works are consistently marked by just a positively shocking profusion of sources at his command, often exceeding 1,000 such sources in a single work, all very carefully noted in the margins. The margins on that copy are filled with his sources. Further, his linguistic command is humbling to say the least. He worked easily in about 9 different languages, including Greek, Latin, Aramaic, and Hebrew, along with a variety of vernaculars. But the vicissitudes of rebellion, war, and the shifting sands of politics ultimately foreclosed upon the possibility of the Del Rio family and political ambitions. His father would ultimately die penniless in exile, having once commanded a castle as a newly minted lord. And as his place in the political world collapsed around him, Martins increasingly sought refuge in the religious world and would join the Jesuits in 1600. Again, not who you'd expect to produce one of the largest works on the occult. It's more of a Dominican thing. But it would be the 1597 sorcery trial of the Benedictine monk Jean de Vue that would actually inspire his sustained interest in the occult, turning that tremendous erudition onto the topic of magic and its prosecution more generally. The result would be 6 books and 3 volumes of the Investigations into Magic that he would republish over a couple of years, editing what would become the final version in 1608. He would then promptly die that year at the age of 57. Though to be clear, the Investigations into Magic is not a singular work, especially given the context of the latter 16th century. Indeed, that whole period saw an explosion of publications on everything from Witchcraft, alchemy, sorcery, ghosts, werewolves, and just the occult generally. Now, what explains such a surge is actually debated by scholars, but outbreaks of plague, famine, and war are typically historically good predictors of that kind of interest, and there was a lot of that in the last 2 decades of the 16th century. Think of the massive uptick in interest on the occult and witchcraft beginning in the early 2020s. But beginning with Jean Bodin's really important Demomanie in 1580, the period to 1600 would see no less than 30 such volumes published, including the 1597 Demonology, published by none less than King James VI and First. Even monarchs were entering into the publishing business about witchcraft. Now, I've done a whole episode about that. You can also check out Atun Shea Films' amazing rendition of most of that text in original pronunciation. In fact, just those 2 decades, from 1580 to 1600, are enough to keep this channel going busy for years. From the production of supernatural poisons, werewolves, witchcraft analysis, tracks on demons and ghosts, debates on just how the evil eye works, or how judicial prosecution for sorcery should even happen. There are dozens of these volumes produced at this time. Sometimes people ask me if I ever worry about running out of content. The only people that would ever ask me if I'm ever going to run out of content are people who don't know much history about just these 2 decades, frankly. But Del Rio opted to research and publish this volume because, frankly, to his mind, this was a vast literature, but it did actually not do well to actually represent the supernatural crisis of his era. For him, it was all too intellectually thin, poorly researched, and unrooted in solid history, theology, and jurisprudence. Del Rio thought it was all demonological weak sauce. So he sought to produce the textbook on the occult and how to correctly prosecute illicit occultism. And, well, to my mind, he did it. He did just that. But finally, just as a bit of more context, it's worth mentioning that just what witchcraft means, Maleficium meant in Del Rio's time. And it's worth making an important distinction between the people, mostly women prosecuted for witchcraft in the late medieval and early modern period, and the notion of the witch as it developed in the minds of people like inquisitors and witch hunters, and the contemporary people, the people nowadays who identify as witches as part of their religious and spiritual vocations. These are historically totally distinct phenomenon, and it's very important to separate them dramatically. For the purposes of this episode, I'm going to reserve the term witch and witchcraft for what scholars now refer to as the elaborated theory of witchcraft. This is the mature notion of witchcraft as it developed in the minds of people like inquisitors and jurists, theologians, and philosophers, primarily in the late medieval period, but also really
I still have
modern period.
some more smoke salmon left to go.
Here we go.
I'll
A
have another
new
slice.
woman-led heretical sorcery sect had appeared in Europe, marked by entering into a pact or covenant with the devil, and thus apostatizing or hereticating from Christianity. This would include things like sexual relations with the devil and demons, aerial flight for the purposes of attending a Sabbath, or
Now, why do they be doing
collaboration,
that?
sometimes a synagogue
Making pacts and shit.
of witches, which was of course presided over by Satan himself, at which initiates were entered into said pact, followed by all kinds of incestuous and promiscuous sex, sometimes with animals, but certainly with each other, and the general practice of
Of course they would do
magic,
that.
maleficium, hence the term witchcraft. This would include also things like the slaughter of fetuses and babies and various means for preventing human procreation. All of this, whose aim was to undermine Christendom as part of the devil's ongoing war with God, which by this time was reaching in a positively apocalyptic proportions, and the argument basically was that this new witch heresy was the final attempt on the part of the devil and his forces to forestall his impending doom by sending human beings down a horrifying spiral of sin and crime as final outrages against God. Basically, if he could just keep getting people to damn themselves, he could delay being damned himself. Regardless, the elaborated theory of witchcraft, while it varied from region to region or writer to writer, had basically coalesced around the time of 1500, and thus it set the stage for the frenzy prosecutions which would follow, resulting in the death of about 40 to 60,000 people, overwhelmingly women. This would last from roughly about 1450 to about 1750, and thus Del Rio inherited a version of the elaborated theory of witchcraft, which he deepened and expanded and gave all kinds of justification for. And despite some skepticism about it arising in the 16th century, notably in Johann Weier's 1563 De Prestigiis Daemonum on the trickery of demons,
Let's have
a
a
text
look over
that Del
again.
Rio sought to refute in his book, he more or less
Hey,
accepts
you know,
the
for my first
foundation,
convention, I'm actually
though
having
with
a really great
bit
time
less
hanging out.
credulity than
Oh,
Bodine
yeah, I'm
me,
glad to hear
and
it. This
certainly
is
less
certainly a
credulity
lot better than the last
mine.
convention I was at.
But, to be clear,
Really?
Rio
What
is
was wrong
on
with it?
team prosecuting
Well,
witches.
some
But more
weirdo
to the
brought a
point, Del
shotgun and
Rio
just blew his
thought
head
this
off
whole
right in the
movement
middle
was
of it.
founded by a far more
Damn,
heretical force
that
and a far more
sucks.
dangerous force than
Oops,
any
looking
witches and
pretty good,
sorcerers
if I do
combined.
say so myself.
Protestants. Indeed,
Making some
Del
good
Rio
progress
even
on this.
contended that the sudden rise in witchcraft, necromancy, plagues, war, and death can just be laid right at the feet of the new Protestant heresy, with
But
Martin
that
Luther and
said,
especially John Calvin
I'll give it to
having
the end of
done
this
more
video,
for
then I'll
the
wrap
devil
up the
than
stream,
any
because then I could
women
concentrate
fancies
more
about by night
and
with
finish
demons.
it off
But as he
stream.
points out in book 1 of the investigations, it's all basically connected to a singular sin, that of superstitione, superstition. For Del Rio, superstition was A, forms of worship which were generally superfluous to genuine religious piety, but really when those forms employ idolatry, explicitly or implicitly in the absence of true
I'm trying to
piety.
think what sort
And
of
course, Protestant
stands I might
regions
have in the
been wrapped
background.
with the worst
Well,
form of
more
superstition,
stands,
because
besides
God had
from
abandoned
Fat Titty
them because they were all
Cat-Girls.
heretics. That worst form of superstition was magic. Providing detailed linguistic etymologies, Del Rio provides a genealogy of magic. There's natural magic, which are wonders accomplished given the natural, though hidden, properties of substances in the world. There is artificial magic, which are effects accomplished through human ingenuity and trickery. And there was, of course, demonic magic, satanic marvels accomplished through the making of a pact, an implicit or explicit pact with demons. Natural magic he thought of as mostly licit, and it can include both operative magic, the use of specific occult forces to some specific end, and divination, which also admits of some licit modes like chiromancy, divining people's personality from their hands, and illicit modes like judicial astrology. Demonic magic, of course, was most often takes the forms of illicit operations, like finding buried treasure, because welcome to Esoterica, and divination, harmful magic, or malefice, and general superstition, which we would now consider something like folk magic. Del Rio quickly dispenses with natural magic, which employs sigils, signs, and numbers, which are
I
all
don't think it
basically
would be
amulets.
a
They
convention
either
without
work
like a
evil with
hentai
alcohol,
stand.
something might be like the placebo effect, thus making them superstition, though demonic intercession making them all forbidden, or just they don't work at all. Further, the church has a tradition of non-superstitious avenues for things like protection, curing illnesses, and specific operations like finding something lost. They have a saint for basically everything, and that the pious should turn to those in time of need and not magical trickery. It's possible that astrological talismans can have some effect, but these are almost always for Del Rio tied up with demonic influence or mediated through demonic influence, and they should basically all be avoided, what the medievals actually termed astral necromancy. Finally, in the end of book 1, there's a discussion of alchemy, because of course there is a discussion of alchemy because it's a big ass book. Alchemy is mostly fraud, and alchemical gold is either produced accidentally or with demonic help, and while it's possible to create gold by art, something that he points out has never fully been demonstrated in public, alchemy should basically only be practiced by the well-established and the wealthy because they actually don't need gold, lest, poor people or middle-class people let their greed lead them into demonic temptation in their thirst to create gold and thus pact with the devil. This is going to be a repeating theme. And in general, this sets the pattern, as I said, for everything that Del Rio will follow, attempting to thread the needle between when a practice becomes superstition at best or involves idolatrous, demonic pact-making at worst, and finally then, of course, how to investigate, prosecute, convict, and punish such offenses. So the answer for this entire episode is, it's making a pact with the devil, or it doesn't work. Be a good Catholic. Book 2 is the longest of the 6 by far, and it deals with magic accomplished through pacts with evil spirits in 30 detailed questions. Along with the rigor of the argumentations, to be honest, these sections are also invaluable, and they provide a corpus of copious examples of historical instances of magical practice. We just learned a ton about magical practices from Del Rio, kind of on accident. He would hate that. But, sorry, Del Rio. In this way, this volume is a vast compendium of anecdotes about magical practices, from ceremonial necromancy to dozens examples of folk magic. Some of these also include Del Rio's own experience, such as the time that he met a water dowser in Spain, or the time he was shown a vast bricked up structure that was once an entire academy of magic
Bricked
in former
up.
Islamic Spain, which we gotta find that. That's like a for real esoteric field trip, the hidden school of magic in Spain. But what stands out is the sense that Del Rio is stating the facts, frankly, as far as he has them, and that he's treating them with a sense of critical appreciation. Overall, his positions seem often unsatisfactorily equivocal. In some sense, yes. In some sense, no, he'll often detail. But he's never trying to find the devil everywhere he looks, like some of these guys, and he's also not a skeptic, dismissing evidence as just fabrication under torture or the raving of demented, senile, or insane people. He's a truly careful thinker. I mean, he is.
Man, why are insane people like
whether you
that?
agree with him or not, he is careful. And rarely, basically never, do you see him twisting the facts to come to a conclusion that he wants, or twisting his criteria of investigation to capture more data than is warranted. I mean, this is the kind of scholarship that you can find yourself kind of agreeing with and then realize I'm agreeing with a demonologist and a witch hunt. And his discussion in book 2 is proof for this method. Pacts with demons can be explicit or implicit, they can be written or oral, but once they're made, they convert the believer into a heretical person until confession, penance, and repentance. Of course, no evil spirits or any form of derivative magic is operative without the consent of God, and no spirits can contravene the laws of nature without divine approval. Thus, the vast majority, almost all of what all these evil spirits do, is basically born out of illusions, tricks, and deceptions from the fact that demons are frankly real old, real knowledgeable, their memory never fades, they can fly, they can travel very quickly, and they can impress our ideas directly upon our fantasia and upon our imaginations, and they can interact and manipulate how we see them and perceive them. Only rarely does God allow spirits to actually perform supernatural feats. Now, the big question, of course, is why does God allow this to happen at all? And Del Rio comes back to that in a bit, and so will I. So, how do evil spirits know things like the future? No, they don't. But they've been around long enough in history to see patterns in nature. They can fly up real high.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear it. This is certainly a lot better than the last convention I was at.
So a ritual on
Really?
so a day,
What was wrong with
making
it?
the person think that they
Well,
caused
some
magical
weirdo
hail,
brought a shotgun and
those
just blew his head off
necromancers
right in the middle of it.
correlating,
Damn,
causing
that sucked.
to when the storm would actually blow in.
Damn, that
They, of course,
sucks.
know the locations of vast sums of buried treasure, but they mostly perform illusions. The gold that they give people actually turns into dung almost all the time once the sorcerer is arrested.
Oops.
Why is that? Why do they actually never give the sorcerer the goods? Del Rio tells us, because the demons are actually keeping all that treasure that they found buried for the eventual coming of the Antichrist. It's just a vast, demonic Antichrist credit union buried treasure. Yes, evil spirits can copulate with human beings, but any such built children who are born from those unions are actually from the result of semen that's been stolen by demons.
Locked or hidden? What?
Stolen demon semen from sorcerers
Oh,
or
there we go.
executed criminals, and it's possible that women do fly to the Sabbath, but Del Rio thinks much of this is simply demonically induced delusion, but the demons could whisk them over there, yeet them over to the Sabbath, and yeet them back, often in a sad state of affairs. Demons can change anything from one species. Demons cannot change anything from one species to another. That would be a violation of nature, and thus their shape-shifting is again more trickery and illusion. Again, non-physical evil spirits can directly affect our sense impressions and thus alter what we see and hear. And while evil spirits can transport physical objects, They cannot cause animals to speak or bring the dead back to life without divine intervention. Demons, however, can harness the air around them and the elements around them to forge really impressive illusions of specters and monsters and tempests and other further spectacles. In general, evil spirits can cause impressive illusions. They can cause sight and can pretend to supernatural powers, but it's ultimately all tricks. Desperate people, greedy people, lustful people, and otherwise sinful people will make pacts with such beings to satisfy some base desire, get that treasure, or cause harm because they're full of haterade, and this pact hereticates and damns that person, of course, barring confession and repentance, of course, and the spirits can't and won't be able to supply the promised deliverables. Thus, the necromancers and the witches are simply doubly duped. They damn themselves, and they get nothing out of the deal. Such pacts are simply scams. Demons are just scammers. Further, evil spirits can and want to do little in the way of good in the world, but they do delight in causing suffering and chaos. Regrettably, many people are more than willing to be partners in crime with demons, and that they too wish harm upon their fellow man. Thus, Book 3 centers in upon malefice, or harmful magic, typically historically translated as witchcraft, along with superstition, which we'll come back to, which is mostly just folk magic generally. Some malefice is merely the accomplish of bad acts. Things like, I don't know, using the hand of an executed person to make one invisible and light the way during a burglary, as one does. This is the famous Hand of Glory found in so many grimoires. We get a mention of it in Del Rio, of course. In other cases, the harm is more direct. Various forms of supernatural poisoning, the evil eye, enchanted weapons, +1 against lawful good characters, harming children, preventing sexual reproduction, especially making dudes' penises invisible. That really worried these guys, invisivizing their penises. Drying up a mother's milk,
There's quite a
harming
few spells
farm
like that.
animals, the pretense of weather magic, the
I know
infliction
like
of
Borneo
supernatural
black magic
illnesses,
kind of has
causing
something,
people to
a
become
spell similar to
insane,
that.
or just inflaring their sense of jealousy, rage, and lust. And people live fragile, precarious existences, and evil people in league with evil spirits could easily bring great and terrible amounts of harms to others simply out of petty hatred, jealousy, and
Look at this expert
spite.
animation over here. Look how he turns
People
around
also
on the
just want
pivot.
to unduly reward themselves and will seek out supernatural means by which to obtain
Hey,
more out of
hey,
life.
hey,
I
hey.
deserve more. I'm an entitled millennial and I deserve all kinds of things. These extra techniques they try to get from reality are superstitions. These are rituals by which to hack reality to get something from apparently nothing. And they're often just implicit pacts with the devil for Del Rio, and these involve outrages against
I mean,
God,
this is
because in many
technically
cases
done
they
right now, but I
are
kind of want to
greatly
add
involved
more
in the
detail to
illicit
it.
use of otherwise sacred objects like
Like
saints
more
to gaze at
stands,
relics or
maybe
holy salt
more
or
stuff on the
use
ground,
holy
maybe
water to hack reality. Del Rio counters that, of course, God alone grants
another
good to us
stand.
poor sinners, and that prayer is really the true recourse that we have. It's the only recourse we have. It hardly works until people turn to necromancy.
Oh my god,
And
I
he
don't know if it's
details
an
a
age thing, but I just...
fascinating list of
Well, it's also
forbidden
winter, so it
customs
gets
and
dark a lot
immoral
more quicker.
hacks. These are like cheat codes
Well,
to
I've
resist
just been feeling
superstitions,
sleepy
which he
a lot
accuses
lately.
people of trying to obtain a
Super
bounty
lethargic.
from superstition are all basically foolish at best and heretical at worst. We're cursed by Adam we're doomed to earn our bread by the sweat of our brow, and superstitious cheat codes are of no avail.
Guess I could have
Generational
another
wealth
slice of
notwithstanding.
smoked salmon.
If you're born with money, that's a pretty good hack. Compound interest is truly necromancy, so far as I can tell.
It
In
really
book
do be.
4, Del Rio tackles the question of divination, which can include several aspects from predictions about the future, literal prophecy, speaking on behalf of God, foreknowledge about the future, and even knowledge about the distant past. We never think about prophecy as telling us stuff about the distant past, although that's a big deal in Judaism.
Still have a few more slices left.
Christianity. Of course, divinely inspired prophecy is possible. There are prophets in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, but also there's even divinatory processes like the consulting of the Urim and the Thummim. This is the divinatory device on the breastplate of the Israelite high priest. So you can do it licitly, apparently, But illicit prophecy also seems possible as well. Famously, the summoning of the soul of the prophet Samuel by the Baalat Ov, or the so-called Witch of Endor in Star Wars Part 3. I don't know. So the question is how to vet a prophet, a topic already under discussion in the composition of what became the New Testament. Paul's already talking about who's a good prophet, how do you test the spirits and stuff. For Del Rio, the central questions on the moral, physical, and psychological characters of the alleged prophet in question. Are they a righteous person? Are they a fun person? I mean, a profligate person. Are they sober or intoxicated? Are they sane? Or are they a raving lunatic? Further, are they a woman? Because misogyny, while not dripping with the constant hatred of women of virtually all other demonological manuals, I mean, Del Rio's got his share, the investigation is actually not without
I wouldn't necessarily say it's
Here
misogyny.
the text notes that women are simply more prone to demonic attack and deception, therefore, if it's a woman talking, you should be cautious. However, Del Rio does admit that there have been a great many holy lady prophets, such as Hildegard, so all the prophet ladies. So, are they Catholics in good standing? Are they chaste? And most of all, are they virgins? Because that's a good indicator of whether or not God's talking
Man,
to them.
it's been a while since I've
Next
done like
comes
a
analysis
proper
of
animation,
itself. Does it
or at least an
align with
animation
unorthodoxy?
at this
Does it
level.
lead to deeper piety? If you tell a bunch of people that God told
Even
you
if
to
it
do
is
bad
just
stuff,
one
your
big
prophecy's
shit
probably
post.
not coming from God, it's coming from, I don't know, Paimon or something. Del Rio then dives into a detailed, exhaustive description of various forms of divination, showing how evil spirits can inspire, manipulate, intrude upon each and every one of them, thus rendering them all at least liable to superstition, if not, you guessed it, grounds for demonic pacts. How so? Well, simply put, the future is the unique prerogative of God, and no demon, no matter how powerful, can know it to a certainty. If they did, then we wouldn't have free will, and we couldn't choose to be Christians, and then God could not damn us. But demons are smart.
Just trying to think of what
Efficient
stars I
causation
might
is
have.
relatively predictable. By the grace of God, the cosmos is intelligible as such. And because of the rapidity of the movements of the demons, they can know what's coming before people do. Thus, and again, it's just trickery made to look like divination. Like
There we
the
go, I'll
demons
do a
know what's going on in the
self-insert.
future. Further, when pressed, the demons or false prophets rely on vagaries and equivocations and obfuscations to hide their ignorance. It all turns into the great bear will fight the eagle on the third river of the 8th star. And of course, people are happy to rely on such false divination given what we are naturally fearful of, the future, because we have no idea what's going to happen half the time. So we're more than happy to listen to psychos tell us stuff about it. Thus, reading lots, dreams, or bolts of lightning for information about the future tells us more about our own fears and hopes more than anything about the future itself, Del Rio points out in a moment of surprisingly wonderful insight about human nature. Further, trials by ordeal are rejected as superstition, including the famous swimming of witches, dunking them in the water to see if they float and that they're a witch. This is all meant to basically induce a miracle. You're basically forcing God to do a miracle or divine action, and that's an example of heinous hubris for Del Rio. Indeed, such trials by ordeal had already been officially forbidden by the church way back in the 13th century Fourth Lateran Council, so get with the program, people. Quit dunking witches. One even gets the sense that Del Rio finds systematically going through virtually each and every example of divination as an entirely tiresome exercise. He basically admits as much at the end of book 4, but yet for anyone interested in the history of magic and the occult, these extremely detailed discussions, anecdotes, and examples are an absolute treasure trove for understanding historical magic in theory and practice. Again, I don't recommend going to Del Rio just to get out those little cool nuggets of magic, but nuggets they are. With book 4 concluded,
nuggets.
some
I could go for some
680
chicky
pages
nuggies.
in, the final 2 books cover the judicial procedures for investigating, prosecuting, and adjudicating the especially difficult of bringing heretical superstition, especially demonic magic, to justice.
Let's see.
Del Rio likens the whole business to a vast infection with the judges acting as doctors. Now, doctors, of course, there need to be treatments, and those treatments need to do more to actually cure and not worsen the condition in the patient, Christendom. And these sections represent the most modern, at least for that time, analysis of how to conduct a witch trial, or rather a trial involving the heretical use of magic born from satanic pacts. Now, this is a fascinating, very involved section spanning over 200 pages in 41 questions, from originating an investigation, evidential requirements, including, yes, the use of torture, he does discuss it, the adjudication of this, penance, and relaxing a relapsed heretic to the secular arm for future punishment, which necessarily means they're going to be, it's not going to go well for them. All in all, it's the most detailed how-to guide for conducting a witch trial ever composed in many ways. And for that reason, I'm going to be making a whole episode. There's going to be a whole upcoming episode basically on this chapter called How to Conduct a Witch Trial, where I'll be comparing Del Rio with previous such textbooks on witch hunting. So a future episode on the exact mechanisms of investigating, prosecuting, and adjudicating heretical sorcery trials. So hopefully that won't be used by Project 2025 in the future. Yeah, we're all going to be living in a Handmaid's Tale soon. Under his eye. The final book details the complicated role of the confessor in these proceedings. Recall that the sacrament of confession is sealed, and the priest who hears the confession generally cannot pass on the details of that confession to others. In fact, Del Rio says that a priest who does this has to be defrocked and subject to life imprisonment, which is no joke in 1600. However, penance and reconciliation is not possible without a full confession, and so discussions follow about, again, how to thread the needle of the role of the confessor with the necessary prosecution of heretical sorcery. Finally, what role should the confessor play in assisting those victims of malevolent sorcery? What about the victims here? Of importance here is that the confessor not play into the desire of the victim for further superstitious cures for their malefice. Evil spirits may appear to be working from, cursed dolls, typically called puppets, amulets, evil books, or any form of other magical devices. But these magical devices are mere tokens of demonic affliction. They actually have no real power in themselves, despite what the necromancer or so-called witch may have thought. And further descent into superstition. Fighting superstition with superstition only opens the door to further potential heresy. Thus, confessors can compel the heretics.
Just a couple more slices of smoked salmon left to go.
To provide peace of mind to their victims, even compelling them through a moderate form of torture to do so. Of course, redirection is what's in order here. Rather than indulging in victims' desire for further superstition, the confessor should point them in the direction of prayer, the sacraments, exorcisms.
Confess!
Ringing church bells. I can break the back of the demons. Just other legitimate and moreover effective means to
I like the sound of church
supernatural
bells.
evil. Again, you can't fight superstition with superstition because the superstition, it hereticates you. And we want to avoid that. And with that, this text comes to an end at the end of book 6. This massive volume comes to an end, and trust me, my summary here has done no justice to this amazing text. But it ends with a summation of the whole work in 12 points.
Gonna
Among
quickly
them,
save
evil
this.
spirits are real, and if you're going to be a Christian, you got to believe in them. Pacts with those evil spirits are illicit, and such pacts should be punished. They must be punished as heresy. The dangers of superstition, discernment for supernatural phenomena, legitimate remedies against supernatural evil, the dangers or curiosities about sorcery, guilty of that one, distancing oneself from magical practitioners, advice for exorcists, and how to avoid superstition in one's own ritual life. In effect, evil spirits are real, and they are running a vast phishing scam.
I'm just looking
your
for
soul.
people to raid.
But to go back to an earlier point, why does God allow all this stuff to happen? Why does God allow these demons to do all this? Well, of course, at some level, it's just a mystery, Why does God do anything? The Lord works in mysterious ways.
He really do work in mysterious
murderous
ways.
But Del Rio hazards some traditional answers here. One, of course, to test and show human beings that they can overcome demonic powers through faith and through faith alone.
Well, I think we've come a
Big
long
books like
way
this.
since I
And
started
it
the stream.
allows
How long
human
have I
beings to
been doing
improve
this
their
for?
virtue and deepen their
Just
faith.
over 2
Finally,
hours.
God
That is
allows demons
perfectly
to
fine
destroy
by
people
my
of their
standards
free will, and punish
Especially since
evildoers
I haven't
for
streamed in a
their
few
sins
days.
in this lifetime. That's what you get for studying all that evil magic. You get punished. For Del Rio, to be sure, the human soul is the great battleground between good and evil, and heretical, superstitious magic was the
Might
greatest
want to
weapon
fix
of
up
the
this
forces
last
of
frame
darkness
here.
in these
Give him a
final
less,
years
a less
before the rise of
awkward
the Antichrist
posture.
and his vast amount of underground treasure that I want, and the
Well, actually,
apocalyptic
this character is
incursion
supposed to be me
course
in the dream.
to the cosmos, where God and Jesus will win, apparently.
Amen.
Following the first edition of the 1599-1600 Del Rio's investigation of magic, it would see a half a dozen editions before his death in 1608. More than a dozen more editions, summaries, and translations would appear before that final modern edition, final printing in Cologne in 1755, nearly the coda of the nightmare of the early modern witch hunts coming to an end. His book landed in the midst of the worst period of the witch hunts, the murders reaching their apex around 1650 before sharply dropping off into the 18th century. By then, older manuals such as the Malleus Maleficarum or Bodin were seen as a bit old-fashioned, and in the case of the Malleus, theologically questionable at best. And Del Rio and Nicolas Remy were even discussed together. They called together to publicly discuss the state of witchcraft in Europe during their own lifetimes.
Think of a different stand.
And yet, Del Rio's text represents the shift toward moderation and careful consideration in the diagnosis and persecution of heretical sorcery trials. But we have to be honest, we have to admit that it was at the forefront of urging on those very trials, especially in the Low Countries, at their apex, while skeptical voices like that of Johannes Weyer were drowned out in these very pages. The 1608 Compendium Maleficarum was famous for its lurid woodcuts, would pillage from Del Rio's text widely, along with many important textbooks of witchcraft in English. The Guide to Grand Jurymen, the most famous and influential text in the witch trials at Salem, was directly influenced by Del Rio, including dozens of others, frankly. The text was also used by lawyers defending so-called witches using Del Rio's careful judicial procedures as a means to pump the brakes on shoddy and rushed jurisprudence. Even the odd necromancer was sometimes found from time to time with their own copy, apparently using it for much the opposite reasons intended by Del Rio. Voltaire, for his part, would find the textbook a horror of medieval
Hey, you
superstition
know, for my
itself
first
and the
convention, I'm
Enlightenment.
actually having a
He
really great
together
time hanging
such
out.
manuals from Nicholas
Yeah, I'm glad to
Emmerich,
hear
Malleus
it. This
Maleficarum,
is
and
certainly a
finally
lot
Del
better than the
Rio.
last convention
They
I
would
was
keep
at.
them all together as one
Really?
massive
What was wrong
heap
there?
of horror,
Well,
testifying to the long
some weirdo brought a
nightmare
shotgun and
of
just
the
blew his head off right
irrational
in the middle of it.
ages and its
Damn,
extreme,
that
horrifying
sucks.
religious violence. Of course, Del Rio and most of the other texts of this time period would come to be forgotten as Malleus Maleficarum came to represent the whole literature as a kind of macabre metonymy. But, of course, the entire genre of demonological literature from Johann Neider's 1430s for Macarius to Del Rio's 1600 investigations is a rather internally diverse works, witness to shifts, changes, mutations, and dynamisms all its own. Malleus Maleficarum was neither the first nor was it the last word on heretical sorcery, witches, and the occult. If any text was the last word on those topics, it was Del Rio's investigations into magic. And for that reason, it's well worth the study. The definitive study of Del Rio's life is Jan Mikkelson's magisterial, but unfortunately rather expensive study. It's probably worth it if you're going to get it into Del Rio. It's fantastic. You have two options for studying Del Rio's investigations. Well, I think you have three options. The first and the easiest is the Praxis text by Peter Maxwell Stewart. Here the edition alternates between translations of the books along with some sections that are merely summarized. It's pretty handy and frankly pretty inexpensive, giving you access to at least the gist of the text, but to be honest, it's falsely advertised on sites like Amazon as a full translation. It absolutely is not a full translation. Now, if you do want to read the entire 6 volumes in full, wonderful text with the Latin facing and lots of footnotes, you can consult the new 6-volume edition by the same author and Valverde in all of its glory. for only $1,200 for the whole set. Because Brill, yep, $1,200 for 6 volumes. Speak of the devil, as they say. So you can check those out from a university library because, you know, everyone has access to university libraries and, you know, $1,200 to buy books. Regardless, I'm not quite done with Del Rio, as I mentioned. I'm going to eventually make that how to conduct a witch trial episode at some point in the future so you can actually see how witch trials really were conducted, at least based on the investigations. And we'll come back to it. Oh yeah, I mentioned a third option. If you want to read Del Rio, you can pick up a copy, an early modern copy of text, like this one. You can get these at auction for sometimes nearly the price of those Brill editions. So you can literally get a 300-year-old copy sometimes for the same price as you can pick up books
Sometimes.
from Brill. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.
Cool. Well, I timed that perfectly, perfectly fine. I cut that just fine. Yeah, I'm just gonna continue this off stream, and I don't know, I might play with some Lego tomorrow as a 35-year-old man. Yeah, it should be fun. Looking forward to it. And I'll raid. Fine, I'll raid someone. Fine, I'll do it. There we go. I'm gonna raid Maria Arachnia. She is playing. What is she playing? She's playing Hollow Knight Silksong. I've never played that game before, but I heard it's all about books. And from what I understand, she's a book too, as she is a spider lady. But yeah, until next time, take it easy and good night. Bye. I'm gonna enjoy some cake after this. Bye.